All right. Hello, everyone. This is Linda Semlitz, and I'm one of the team leads for the psychological first aid team. And here is Britt Gonsolin.
Hi, I'm Dr. Gonsolin, Britt Gonsolin, and Linda and I work together on teaching psychological first aid. So that's what we're about to do now.
This video was prepared so that you can train about psychological first aid whenever you have time to do so. And at the end of this presentation, we're going to show you how to take a full training should you have an interest in doing so. So our team includes a number of people: Britt Gonsolin, myself, Linda Semlitz, Gina Wind, Mary Stowell, and Laura Sachs. And we've been all working together to share psychological first aid to people on Bainbridge Island during this pandemic. Britt, do you want to talk about the mission?
I'd love to. So psychological first aid team that we just listed here has a mission, and that's to promote safety, connectedness, and self-empowerment to the citizens of Bainbridge Island to calmly care for themselves and others in the event of a disaster or crisis, which we know we're currently living.
So psychological first aid. I first learned about psychological first aid when I was living in Japan during the tsunami, nuclear meltdown, and Great Japan earthquake in March of 2011. And very similar to what's going on now, we found that it took quite some time before people could pause long enough in the midst of a disaster to say, gee, I'd like to know more about psychological first aid because I'm seeing that there are mental health effects as well as other effects. So what is it? It's a first-line psychosocial support given to both yourself and to others following a crisis or a disaster. And anybody can provide it. We primarily would like first responders, team leads, medical providers, but anybody who's helping out in the course of a disaster, including you and your Map Your Neighborhood work. Britt, you want to talk about why?
Sure. So we like to talk about why psychological first aid is important. And the idea here is that when all members of a community, regardless of their role, can begin to provide psychological first aid to one another, it creates a collective resilience that actually can begin to help mitigate the effects of a disaster, which include trauma. And we like to talk about the term vicarious resilience. This term actually means that by calming ourselves, by caring for ourselves psychologically, that we can not only affect our own nervous systems in a positive way, but we can begin to actually bring down the activation level of other people's nervous systems around us. And when you imagine a large group of people doing this simultaneously, it creates a collective vicarious resilience in one another. And so we like to say, when do we use psychological first aid? And of course, we hope that even outside of a disaster time frame, that we're using psychological first aid every day to support each other and ourselves.
So one of the things that we know about in a disaster is that when a disaster hits, there's a big surge, a surge of people who are in distress. And the reason we're engaging in this is, as Britt said, to mitigate distress, psychological distress, and increase resilience because we don't have enough resources to take care of everyone. So this is the first step in a public health response to a disaster. And as you know, there are many phases of a disaster. This is an interesting disaster. In fact, many phases are going on all at the same time. But psychological first aid can be used in any part of a disaster, in all phases of a disaster.
And Linda, I can talk about this slide and let everyone know that the World Health Organization has a nice way of defining the three different components of psychological first aid. And so we talk about the 3 L's, and they're look, listen, and link. So the next part of our presentation will really be detailing what do we do when we look, listen, and link, and how do we practice these skills on a daily basis. So when we look, we're observing ourselves and others for signs of stress. That's always step 1. And when we move on to step 2, we're really engaging our listening skill, which is to listen to ourselves and others to further assess what needs might be. And finally, we seek to link And that's basically making connections between people and resources that will encourage good coping and support.
So when we talk about looking, the first and most important thing is safety. We want to make sure that everyone is physically safe, that we're physically safe first, and that precedes any other action that we engage in. And we want to take a personal inventory. Am I calm or panicky? The first time I taught psychological first aid in the early parts of the earthquake response in Tokyo, I was still running around like a chicken with her head cut off, but didn't really take time to take my own pulse and notice that. And people did. And I really quickly learned that I was going to have to be in a much calmer and stable and grounded place if I was going to offer help to anyone. It's nearly impossible to provide good psychological first aid in a crisis if we don't recognize our own stress reactions and take steps to embody a calm presence. So think about for a moment, what are your own personal signs of distress and stress, and what do you do to center yourself emotionally and physically? During the Japan disaster, I ended up using slow breathing and box breathing, which we'll talk about a little bit later, every 30 minutes or so if I needed to. If I can say I am safe, I am calm, then I know that I can begin to work with others and observe whether or not they are having stress responses as well. Britt, do you want to talk about stress reactions in adults and kids?
Right. So as Linda said, now that we've observed ourselves and we've determined that we're calm enough and collected enough to move into looking for signs of stress in others, here's a handy chart to reference. And what we like to point out first and foremost is that stress reactions in adults occur in a number of different areas. And we like to break it down into feelings, thoughts, physical effects on the body, behaviors, and also spiritual changes that you might be observing. And so as you can see with this chart, the feelings, thoughts, physical effects, etc., can range pretty widely. For feelings, for instance, we have feelings that might be normal in the event of a stressful reaction, ranging from rage and anger to withdrawal and a sense of numbness, right? So the idea here is that we're letting people know what to look for that consists of normal signs of stress. And we like to say normal signs of stress because we all experience these. It's part of our physiologic response to a stressful situation. And if we can recognize these signs in others that we're observing, we can remind ourselves this person is undergoing an incredible amount of stress. How do I then assess what needs they might have? And so go ahead, Linda. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, no.
So you can take some time to look through this chart, but the point is that these different effects can range from person to person. Someone might be only experiencing physical effects, and some person might be having more feeling changes kind of in their stress response. So just be on the lookout for these different signs.
And I even noticed myself that I'm having a hard time 6 weeks into our community quarantine concentrating. I'm just not as sharp as I was. I'm not as organized as I was. I'm not sleeping as effectively as I was, although I'm quite functional. And these are really all normal responses and shared. So it's really important to understand, again, that this is a response in a public health manner to people who have normal stress reactions to a crisis and a disaster. It's not a treatment. Children show many of the same kinds of effects that adults do, but you often see them regress developmentally. They may act a whole lot younger than they normally do. They may end up having more outbursts or tantrums or be naggy or clingy, and they frequently have lots of physical symptoms. If they're having a hard time putting their feelings into words, they may tell you that they're having belly aches and headaches and they just don't feel right. So step 2 and 3 go on to listening and linking. And how we do these are quite particular for psychological first aid. Britt,
So when we talk about listening, we're really talking about embodying a kind, calm, and compassionate presence or stance. Again, if we're becoming overexcited or loud or too forceful in how we respond to someone, that may actually be counterproductive and certainly won't make us very effective. So we like to talk about active listening. And I think if you can learn one thing from this presentation, it would be the skill of active listening, and you can take that back to your situation. So what is active listening? Well, we're going to first remind you again that people really benefit when they are heard. And active listening is probably the best thing we can do to help someone feel heard, because what we're doing is we're reflecting back to the person what we hear. So we're taking in and digesting their story, and we're reflecting that back to them. And so it's a reminder that when we're responding to someone from an active listening stance, we're actually reflecting their story and not ours. We also like to remind people that when we actively listen and reflect, it's important not to give advice. A lot of times we feel that advice giving can empower others, but in this instance, from a psychological first aid standpoint, we're encouraging people to simply reflect and let people know that they've been heard.
So examples of active listening really allow you to some extent, paraphrase what you've heard. We're all in this pandemic together, and I see that Britt's being a mom as well as a psychological first aid trainer. Good for you, Britt. So an example might be, for active listening might be, hey, everything you're telling me helps me see how stressed you really are right now. It's important to use your own words when you paraphrase, otherwise people feel like you're doing some psychological something or other to them. But find your own way of summing up what you've just heard, either emotionally or factually. Hear somebody's story and summarize what their needs are, or what you hear, what their needs might be. And sometimes presence and listening are the most powerful ways to connect, and it may be the only thing that you need to do.
Linda likes to remind me all the time that there's this saying that we use, it's don't just do something, stand there. And so this is sometimes a good way to actively listen, is to just stand there and be present and to sort of take it all in.
So when we're linking people to resources, in addition to finding out what their list of needs are, we need to sometimes watch out for each other, especially first responders, because first responders like to run into danger and take care of people and fix things. And sometimes one of the things they don't take care of is themselves. And so checking on each other is really important. Asking coworkers or others, hey, have you had something to eat or drink right now? Are you having any medical issues that I need to know right away? When's the last time that you were able to take a break? Are you able to come take a walk with me?
I wanted to mention too, Linda, that my background, and I didn't have psychological first aid training back in 2005 when I had to flee from Hurricane Katrina, and I ended up in Lafayette, Louisiana for the 3 weeks following the storm. And we evacuated to the Cajun Dome, and they set up a Red Cross medical relief facility there. And a bunch of us medical students at the time were all there, and we hadn't had any clinical training yet. And so we were really at a loss as to what we could do. Our skills in providing direct medical care were fairly limited. But what we ended up doing was shuttling back and forth from the physician relief area, which was a room in the arena that had been set up to provide physicians with snacks and water so that they could provide medical relief services. But of course, none of them were going to this area. They were all out in the trenches, taking care of people and, helping manage medical issues. And so a bunch of us medical students decided, well, we're just going to be farriers of bottles of water and snacks. And so I remember one of the most helpful things we did during that whole time, and I didn't know what it was at the time, but it was providing basic resources and helping these physicians who were working 12-hour shifts without a break to have some of their basic needs met by making sure they were hydrated or that they'd had a snack. And so when we learned a little more about psychological first aid years later, I thought, hey, without knowing it, one of the things that we actually did to be most helpful was to provide people with some of their kind of basic needs.
That's a great story, Brett. Thank you. So when people are asking us questions, and there are lots of questions, especially in a time of uncertainty like this, we want to only give realistic reassurance. So we can say washing hands and social distancing and wearing a mask give us the best chance to protect ourselves and others. But we have to make sure that what we say is accurate and timely, and we can only say what we know is true and when we know it. This is an ongoing disaster, and I was thinking back to the disaster in Japan. To some extent, it was the same thing because there was a nuclear meltdown, 4 reactors melted down, and there was radioactivity. And we didn't know what the facts were about danger and radioactivity. The government wasn't clear about that. Sometimes they weren't honest about that. And there were all sorts of rumors going around. So it's very important that the information that you share is accurate and timely. Say only what you know is true when you know it, and avoid false reassurances, such as, I'm sure everything will be fine, because you don't know if everything's going to be fine. Or you're young and healthy, so you'll be okay. And we know that even people who are young and healthy are not always okay. Britt, do you want to talk about coping, positive coping?
Of course. So part of how we link people with resources to support them psychologically is recognizing when they themselves might be using ineffective coping strategies. And so we like to remind people that using things like alcohol or substances like marijuana excessively can actually be an ineffective or more maladaptive coping strategy. So if you're noticing this, it's just important to kind of have that awareness about a situation or a person and how they're coping. Isolation, avoidance, acting out, these can also be more negative coping strategies. So your job as a psychological first aid provider is really to help encourage people to cope well and to provide opportunities for good coping. And so here we've listed a few. Encouraging kids to play virtually when possible. I know families have really seen a lot of social supports for younger members kind of dissolve with this social distancing. And so remembering that we can connect virtually even with young children, playing card games, virtual games. I know that's kind of taking off. A lot of people are enjoying that. We've also experienced quite a rise in, I would say, really high quality virtual adult activities, things like museum tours. And I know that there was someone I met last week talking about going on a virtual cruise. I'm not even sure what that is, but apparently it's out there. So, really broadening our minds and thinking about ways that we can connect people with good coping. And of course, FaceTiming with friends, having kind of virtual coffee hour. I know a lot of people are getting into that as well. And then, of course, there's the more introverted kind of solo activities that we can engage in, like coloring or drawing, gardening, spending time with our pets and families.
One of the things I think we learned from Katrina, how important social connection is, because I think many families during Katrina were separated
Yes.
or sent to other towns or away from their support systems. Mm-hmm. And this is a particularly challenging disaster because this pandemic requires us to self-quarantine in our homes, so that it really is a little bit more of a challenge to stay connected to people we love or care about or worry about. We live in a neighborhood where we get to see each other going on walks most days and stay 6 foot apart and can say hello, and likewise doing a lot of Zoom meetings with both friends and family members in order to make sure that we all have the social connection and support that we need. So there's a really good website that's been created by Bainbridge Prepares called Bainbridge Island COVID-19 .recovers. And on that, there's lots of information. There's a place where you can ask for help, offer to provide help or items, such as if you have extra masks or been making masks, or to volunteer. There are a lot of other online tools that are frequently used, which we may not think about as being all that useful, but it turns out that they're just perfect for stress during a pandemic like this. Mindfulness meditation apps are easy to learn with these guided meditations. Calm, Headspace, and Breathe are three very popular ones, but there are many others online, many of them at no cost, without a fee. And then there's something called box breathing, which is a simple, slow breathing technique. And when we think about breathing techniques, what we're really concentrating on more than anything else is not so much deep breathing, because sometimes that even does more harm than good. It's slow exhalations against a little bit of resistance, pretending that you're blowing out through a straw for as long as possible. But when we teach a box breathing, it's very simple. We imagine a little box, and I generally hold up a little square, something like this, and we'll tell people to breathe in for 4, to hold for 4, to breathe out for 4, to hold for 4. And that gives you an exhalation of about 8 counts, which is a really long, slow exhale. Against those pursed lips make a little bit of a difference. It allows us to increase our internal pressure receptors, and it slows our breathing, slows our pulse, and tames our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. That you can find on YouTube, but it's pretty easy to learn. And think about your own stress busters that you use every day, because these are things that you and your family and friends can use, or you might suggest to others.
We also like to talk about when it's necessary to seek help from a professional. We've presented all of this psychological first aid material today to teach you about the first line public health, mental health response to a disaster. But of course, sometimes first aid, like medical first aid, isn't going to fit the bill, and you're going to need to look for more support as you would in a situation where, say, someone cut themselves and needed stitches. You're not going to be able to provide the stitches, so you would send them to urgent care, to the emergency room. And the same is true for mental health. If you are providing basic psychological care to someone and you find that their needs really far exceed your ability to meet them, then you have to start thinking about when you may want to refer them to see a therapist or a psychiatrist or even their primary care doctor. And so we like to remind people here on Bainbridge Island that there's the Bainbridge Psychotherapy Guild, which is a lovely resource online to connect you with a potential therapist or physician. And of course, I should have prefaced this by saying, if you're seeing any signs of hopelessness or suicidal ideation in anyone in your community or in your sphere, that would be a good indication to start looking for a higher level of help and meeting that person's needs. So again, a reminder that there is the Guild on Bainbridge Island. There are our primary care and pediatricians, physicians that are, of course, here to help us through these situations and to figure out what the next best step might be. There's also the Kitsap County Crisis Line that can be reached at the following number, which is listed here, but I'll dictate it as well. It's 360-479-3033. And of course, there are psychiatrists, there are nurse practitioners in the community that may also be able to provide services that include medications.
So if you're interested in learning more about psychological first aid, there are a number of ways to do so, and they're all free. The National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, PTSD, and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network both have free PFA trainings online. Now you have to be a little bit patient because these trainings are being used quite frequently right now. So sometimes getting there earlier in the day or later in the day is helpful in terms of accessing them smoothly. And the website is www.nctsn.org, and then go for interventions in psychological first aid. In addition, the Johns Hopkins program is offering a free Coursera right now. So if you look up Johns Hopkins Coursera, you can take an 8-hour class in psychological first aid, which is really quite excellent as well. I've looked at it myself. And then if you think that you want to learn more or your group needs some additional help or would like a somewhat more relaxed and not quite fast-paced introduction, let us know. Contact Bainbridge Prepares. Britt and I our contacts are there, and we can come out and help you and your group. Consult in terms of what we think might be useful for you guys to know or how to do a training in person. Well, thanks for everything. Stay safe, stay well, stay sane, stay home. Bye-bye.
I know.